The air in the makeshift cantina at Forward Operating Base Erebus was a thick, syrupy mixture of stale beer, diesel fumes, and the fine, ever-present grit of the Kandahar Desert. It coated the tongue and clung to the back of the throat, a taste so constant it had become a form of sensory silence. Fluorescent lights hummed a weary, buzzing tune overhead, their harsh white glare bleaching the color from the plywood walls and the tired faces of the men scattered around the dented metal tables. This was a place of decompression, a purgatory between the razor-wire reality of the outside and the fitful, dreamless sleep that awaited in cramped cots. It was a place where stories were currency and bravado was the coin of the realm. In the center of this small universe of masculine energy, Lieutenant Marcus Cutter held court. He was a man carved from the very archetype of a Navy SEAL, a broad, dense superstructure of muscle built upon a frame of unwavering confidence. His face, weathered by sun and sand-blasted by rotor wash, looked as if it had been hewn from naval tradition itself, all sharp angles and a jawline that could cut glass. When he laughed, a booming, percussive sound, the other men at his table, a collection of younger operators from his platoon, laughed with him, their eyes reflecting his own casual dominance. Authority radiated from Cutter like heat from a furnace, an aura of earned arrogance that came from being very good at a very violent job and knowing it. He was recounting a recent raid, his hands sculpting the air, miming the breach of a door, the sweep of a room, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that easily commanded the space. At the edge of this gravitational field, in a corner so shadowed it seemed a part of the wall, a figure sat in deliberate isolation. If Cutter was a roaring bonfire, she was a pilot light, a flicker of existence so unobtrusive as to be almost invisible. She wore a sterile, unadorned utility uniform, its khaki fabric faded from the sun and countless washings. No rank was visible, no unit patches, no name tape. It was an outfit designed for anonymity. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, functional knot at the nape of her neck, revealing a face that was plain, unremarkable, and utterly devoid of expression. It was a face you would forget the moment you looked away. She sat perfectly still, a single bottle of water untouched before her, her gaze directed not at the boisterous men, but at a large, ventilated metal crate tucked beside her chair. Inside, nothing stirred, but her attention was absolute, a silent communion between handler and tool. She was Petty Officer Evelyn Thorne, though no one in the cantina knew her name or her real purpose. To them, she was just the K-9 handler, a support asset who had arrived 2 days prior with her Belgian Malinois, in the rigid, testosterone-fueled caste system of a forward operating base. A female handler occupied a nebulous, often disregarded space. She was not one of the infantry grunts, not one of the swaggering special operators, not one of the grease-stained mechanics. She was an accessory, a specialist whose function was deemed necessary but secondary, like a bomb-sniffing robot, only with a leash. Her presence was a quiet, unassuming fact, and for 2 days, that was all it had been. But Cutter's gaze, sweeping his audience for affirmation, snagged on her stillness. In his world of kinetic energy and loud declarations, her silence was an anomaly. It was a vacuum, and his ego, like nature, abhorred it. He saw a woman, small and plain, in a man's world. He saw a dog in a box. He saw a support troop taking up space in an operator's bar. His worldview, a finely tuned instrument for identifying threats and asserting dominance, processed these inputs and arrived at a simple, foregone conclusion. She was insignificant, and therefore a target for his casual cruelty. He paused his story, a smirk playing on his lips. The sudden silence from the central table caused a ripple effect. Other conversations faltered, and heads turned. "Well, well," Cutter's voice sliced through the low hum of the room. "Look what we have here. The dog walker." A few of his men snickered. Thorn did not move. Her eyes remained on the crate. It was as if he hadn't spoken, as if his voice were just another part of the ambient noise, like the buzzing lights or the distant thrum of a generator. This utter lack of reaction was not what Cutter had anticipated. He expected a flustered response, a nervous glance, perhaps a mumbled defense. Her placid stillness was a denial of his power, an unspoken challenge to his dominion over this space. He pushed his chair back, the metal legs scraping harshly against the concrete floor. He stood and ambled toward her corner, his movements a lazy, predatory saunter. His team watched, their faces a mixture of amusement and anticipation. This was part of the show, the lieutenant reminding everyone of the pecking order. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said, his voice closer now, laced with a condescending edge. He stopped in front of her table, looming over her. "Don't you know where you are? This is a seal bar. We don't get a lot of kennel maids in here." Thorn finally lifted her head. Her eyes, a pale, indeterminate gray, met his. They were flat, analytical, like the lenses of a camera. There was no fear in them, no anger, no emotion at all. It was this unnerving placidity that truly began to irritate him. It was like shouting at a rock. "This is the FOB Erebus MWR facility," she stated, her voice quiet but perfectly clear, each word delivered with clinical precision. "It is open to all assigned personnel." Her response was so fact-based, so devoid of the emotional reaction he was trying to provoke, that it momentarily threw him off balance. He had expected a fight or a flight, not a recitation of base regulations. He scoffed, recovering quickly. "Assigned personnel," he mimicked, drawing out the words in a mocking tone. "Your assignment is to walk that mutt around the wire so it can take a leak. My assignment is to hunt men. We are not the same." He gestured dismissively at the crate. "What's even in there? A poodle? Some kind of glorified rat sniffer?" Before Thorn could answer, a low growl rumbled from within the metal box. It was not a loud sound, but it had a texture, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to press on the air in the room. It was the sound of a finely tuned engine idling at the very edge of the red line. Every man in the cantina, soldiers and operators alike, instinctively recognized that sound. It was the sound of controlled, lethal violence. The snickers from Cutter's table died instantly. Thorn placed a hand gently on the crate. "Ares. Easy," she murmured, her voice a soft command. The growling ceased as abruptly as it had begun. Cutter, however, was too deep in his performance to back down. To him, her calm control was just another affront. He saw her as weak, and the dog's aggression as a liability she could barely manage. He was fundamentally misreading every signal, interpreting her professional discipline as personal fear. "See? You can't even control your own animal," he sneered, his voice rising in volume to mask his own flicker of unease. "What happens when the bullets start flying, huh? Is it going to tuck its tail and run? Or is it going to bite one of our own guys? Maybe you should stick to fetching slippers, sweetheart." He took a step closer, crowding her, his large frame blocking out the light. He was using his physical presence as a weapon, a tactic that had always worked for him. He leaned down, his face just inches from hers, his breath a foul mix of beer and self-satisfaction. "This is our world. You're just a guest here. Remember that. To punctuate his statement, he reached out and gave her shoulder a light shove. It wasn't a violent blow, but it was a clear, unmistakable act of physical assertion. It was the line being crossed. The men in the bar tensed. This had gone from casual hazing to something else. Thorne's body barely moved with the impact. She was rooted to her chair. She did not flinch. She did not recoil. She did not even blink. Her gray eyes remained locked on his, her expression unchanged. But in their flat depths, a new light kindled. Not anger, but something colder. It was the look of a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. She had seen this before. This brand of ignorant pride was a variable she had factored into her calculations countless times. She was a lioness allowing a jackal to dance at the edge of its kill radius, watching with a detached, almost academic curiosity to see what it would do next. The moment stretched, taut and silent. Cutter held his position, expecting her to finally break, to show the fear he felt was his due. But she did not. Her stillness was a mirror, and in it, for a fleeting second, he saw not her weakness, but the reflection of his own boorish insecurity. It was a disquieting image, and it angered him further. Then, the world outside dissolved into a roar. It began as a low moan on the horizon, a sound that every man on the base knew and dreaded. The wind, which had been a persistent but manageable presence, began to shriek. The plywood walls of the cantina groaned in protest. The lights flickered once, twice, then died, plunging the room into a murky twilight, lit only by the emergency strobes that kicked in with a jarring pulse. The air pressure dropped so suddenly it made their ears pop. A fine dust began to seep through invisible cracks in the building's shell, instantly filling the air with a choking haze. The haboob had arrived. Chaos erupted. Men scrambled from their chairs, knocking over tables in their haste. Shouts and curses filled the darkness. Outside, the world was being scoured clean by a solid wall of sand moving at 60 miles per hour. Visibility dropped to 0. The base sirens, a high, piercing wail, began their desperate cry, a sound that was almost immediately swallowed by the colossal roar of the storm. Cutter and his men, their bravado evaporating in the face of a true crisis, instantly shifted into mission mode. They were trained for chaos. "TOC! Everyone to the TOC!" Cutter bellowed, his voice barely audible over the gale. He fumbled for the tactical flashlight on his belt, its powerful beam cutting a shaky cone through the swirling dust inside the cantina. He was a man of action, and action was now required. But his actions were based on a standard playbook: consolidate, communicate, assess. A playbook that was about to be rendered utterly useless. The problem was not the storm itself. The base was hardened. It could withstand the wind. The problem was what the storm was providing cover for. A frantic voice crackled over the base-wide radio network, distorted by the static of the atmospheric interference. "Breach at the detention block! I repeat, breach at! Viper is loose! Viper is in the wind!" A cold dread washed over the room, far colder than the wind outside. Viper was the code name for Tariq al-Jamil, a high-value insurgent leader, a ghost who had taken them 6 months to capture. He was a master of evasion, a strategic genius, and he was scheduled for exfiltration to a black site in less than an hour. His escape during the one event that blinded every piece of surveillance technology on the base was not a coincidence. It was a perfectly executed plan. Cutter and his team surged toward the door, their mission clear. Find the HVT. But it was a fool's errand. Outside the relative shelter of the cantina, the world had ceased to exist. It was a maelstrom of roaring, sand-choked blackness. You couldn't see your own hand in front of your face. Thermal imagers were useless, whited out by the friction-heated sand. Night vision goggles were equally worthless. They were blind. All their technology, all their training, all their strength was nullified. Cutter stood at the threshold, the wind tearing at him, screaming orders that were whipped away into the abyss. He was a commander with no senses, a king in a kingdom of absolute chaos. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at the edges of his legendary composure. They were going to lose him. And then, through the cacophony, a new sound emerged. It was the calm, precise click of a metal latch. In the corner of the cantina, the one Cutter had just vacated, a small, battery-powered lantern had been placed on the table, casting a steady, unwavering circle of light. Within that circle, Thorn was moving. While everyone else had scrambled in panic, she had remained a point of absolute stillness, a singularity of calm in the swirling chaos. Now that stillness had transformed into a fluid, economical grace. There was no wasted motion. Her hands moved with the unthinking certainty of a surgeon, laying out her gear on the small table, a specialized GPS unit with a terrain-following display, a compact radio with a bone conduction headset, a water bladder, and a small, heavily modified harness. She opened the crate. Ares emerged not with a bound, but with a low, controlled slide. He was a magnificent animal, larger than a typical Malinois, with a coat the color of dried blood and eyes like chips of obsidian. He was pure, coiled muscle, and he moved with the silent lethality of a panther. He ignored the storm, the noise, the shouting men. His entire being was focused on Thorn. He sat at her feet, his body rigid with anticipation, awaiting the one command that mattered. Cutter, momentarily baffled by her deliberate actions, turned from the doorway. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted over the wind. "Get away from the door! We're in lockdown!" Thorn didn't look at him. She was fitting the harness onto Ares, her fingers moving deftly over the buckles and straps. "Lockdown is irrelevant," she said, her voice not raised, yet it cut through the noise with impossible clarity. "The target is mobile. The scent trail is degrading with every second the sand scours it from the ground. We have a window of approximately 12 minutes before acquisition becomes statistically improbable." She spoke a foreign language, not of words, but of expertise. It was the language of a master, so far beyond Cutter's own understanding of the situation that he could only stare, dumbfounded. He was thinking about perimeters and guard posts. She was thinking about scent decay and statistical probability. "You're not going out there," he stammered, his authority sounding hollow even to his own ears. "That's a death sentence. It's an order." Thorn finally stood, pulling a pair of sealed goggles over her eyes and wrapping a fine mesh scarf over her nose and mouth. She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw past the plain face and the anonymous uniform. He saw the person behind them, and that person did not recognize his authority. She did not recognize the storm. She recognized only the mission. "Your order is tactically unsound," she said, her voice slightly muffled by the scarf. "It is predicated on a sensory model that no longer applies. In this environment, your eyes are a liability. His," she nodded toward Ares, "are the only asset on this base that matters." She knelt, bringing her face close to the dog's. "Ares," she said, her voice now a low, intense whisper meant only for him. She held a small, vacuum-sealed plastic bag under his nose. It contained a piece of cloth from the HVT's cell. "Viper," she said, using the code name. "Find, seek." The dog's entire body quivered. A low whine escaped his throat. He understood. Thorn stood and took hold of a short, rigid leash attached to the harness. She gave Cutter one last, dismissive glance. "Stay here. Try not to get in the way." And then she stepped into the storm. She did not hesitate. She did not brace herself. She and the dog simply walked into the roaring, opaque wall of sand and were swallowed by it. They vanished. The empty doorway seemed to mock the stunned, useless men left behind. Lieutenant Cutter stood frozen, his orders ignored, his authority broken, his entire conception of the world shattered by a quiet woman and her dog. He was the apex predator who had just discovered that the unassuming creature in the corner of the cave was, in fact, a dragon. Back in the Tactical Operations Center, the storm was a symphony of failure. The massive screens that normally displayed a god's-eye view of the base were now just fields of gray static. Radio channels were a hiss and crackle of panicked, disjointed reports. The base commander, a grizzled colonel named Hayes, stood with his hands on his hips, his face a mask of grim frustration. Beside him, a figure stood in stark contrast. He was an older man, wiry and compact, his face a roadmap of deserts and oceans traversed. He wore no insignia of rank, only a simple set of khakis and a bearing of such profound gravity that it bent the room around him. This was Command Master Chief Vance, a living legend in the naval special warfare community, a man who had been at the tip of the spear since before most of the operators on the base were born. He was here for the HVT handover, and he was now a witness to a catastrophic security failure. "Everything we have is blind, Master Chief," Colonel Hayes said, his voice tight with stress. "We're organizing foot patrols to sweep in concentric circles from the detention block, but it's a shot in the dark. They can't see 5 feet. Vance said nothing. He simply listened, his eyes scanning the chaotic room, absorbing the flow of useless information. It was then that a young communications officer, his voice strained, reported in. "Sir, I have a report from the MWR Cantina. Lieutenant Cutter's fire team is holed up there. He reports that the K9 handler has gone outside." Hayes turned, incredulous. "Gone outside? Is she insane? Who is this handler? Get me a name." The officer typed furiously. "Just a petty officer first class, sir. Transferred in from Bagram 2 days ago. Name is Thorn. Evelyn Thorn." The name hung in the air for a moment. To Colonel Hayes and everyone else in the TOC it meant nothing. But to Master Chief Vance it was a key turning a lock deep inside him. His entire posture changed. The quiet observer vanished, replaced by a man of absolute diamond-hard purpose. His eyes, which had been passive, now burned with a focused intensity. "Thorn," Vance repeated, his voice quiet but carrying an immense weight that cut through the noise. He turned to the communications officer. "Get on Cutter's frequency. Patch him through to me now." A moment later, Cutter's panicked voice filled the speakers. "Can't see a damn thing. The woman is gone. She took the dog and walked right into it. It's a suicide mission." Vance leaned toward the microphone, his voice calm and cold as the deep ocean. "Lieutenant Cutter, this is Trident Actual. Cease your transmissions." There was a stunned silence from the other end. Trident Actual was a call sign reserved for the highest echelons of SOCOM command. For a lieutenant, it was like receiving a personal call from God. "Trident Actual, sir, I don't understand," Cutter stammered. "You are not required to understand, Lieutenant. Vance said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You are required to answer a single question. Did you see the handler's primary call sign? Call sign, sir? She's a K9 handler. She doesn't have a... Answer the question, Lieutenant. Vance's voice was like cracking ice. Cutter was flustered, trying to recall the bizarre encounter. No, sir. She said nothing. Just, She said something to the dog, called the target Viper. Then she said a word. Seek, I think. A flicker of something, relief, confirmation, crossed Vance's face. He turned away from the mic and looked at Colonel Hayes, who was watching this exchange with growing bewilderment. Colonel, Vance said, stand down your foot patrols, all of them. Recall them to their hardened shelters immediately. Stand them down, Hayes protested. Master Chief, we have to find... You will not find him, Vance stated, not as an opinion, but as an incontrovertible fact. They will. Your patrols are now a liability. They are obstacles. They are contaminating the field. He turned back to the communications officer. Open a channel. Encrypted, Tier 1 priority. Designation, Sea Dragon. The officer's fingers froze over his keyboard. Sir, that designation is... It's a legacy call sign. It hasn't been active in years. It is active today, Vance commanded. Open it. The officer complied, his hands shaking slightly. A new frequency, silent and pure, hummed to life. The entire TOC had fallen quiet, the operators and officers sensing that the nature of the situation had fundamentally changed. They were no longer watching a chaotic search. They were watching something else unfold, something far above their clearance level. Vance took the headset himself. Sea Dragon, this is Trident Actual. Report status. How copy? For a long, agonizing moment, there was only static. The wind howled on the open channel. Cutter, listening in from the cantina, held his breath. Then, a voice came through, as clear and calm as if she were standing next to them. It was Thorne's voice, but stripped of all personality, a pure instrument of information. Trident Actual, this is Sea Dragon. Solid copy. We are mobile. We have acquisition. Target is moving northwest along the primary wadi, using the embankment for cover. He is disoriented, but maintaining discipline. Current distance, 400 meters and closing. We will make contact in approximately 3 minutes. Advise your conventional forces to stand clear of grid 34 Delta. I repeat, clear the grid. We are prosecuting the target alone. The transmission ended. The silence that descended upon the Tactical Operations Center was absolute. It was a silence born of pure, unadulterated shock. Colonel Hayes stared at Vance, his mouth agape. The communications officers looked at their screens as if they had malfunctioned. In the cantina, Cutter felt the blood drain from his face. He sank onto a bench, the radio handset slipping from his nerveless fingers. Sea Dragon. The name was not a call sign. It was a myth, a ghost story that senior operators told to frighten new recruits. Sea Dragon was the unofficial designation for the lead operative of a phantom unit so secret it didn't officially exist. Task Force Nomad. They were the troubleshooters, the master trackers, the deniable assets who were sent in when all other options had failed. They specialized in non-permissive environments and sensory deprivation. The operator known as Sea Dragon was said to be the greatest tracker the special operations community had ever produced. A legend credited with finding high-value targets in the trackless jungles of the Amazon, the frozen wastes of the Hindu Kush, and the labyrinthine slums of Mogadishu. A figure spoken of in hushed, reverent tones. A figure everyone assumed was a grizzled, hard-bitten male operator who had been hunting men for 30 years. The narrator's voice, the institutional memory of the military itself, would step in here to fill the void of their understanding. Chief Warrant Officer 4 Evelyn Thorne was not a petty officer. That rank was a convenient fiction, a cloak of anonymity. She was a direct action intelligence officer, a graduate of more classified training programs than anyone in that TOC had ever heard of. Her file was a ghost, accessible only by a handful of people at the highest levels of national security. She held the Distinguished Navy Cross for actions no one was allowed to speak of, a Silver Star for a rescue in zero visibility conditions during a blizzard, and 3 Bronze Stars with Valor devices. Her partner, Ares, was not a dog. He was a canine sensory augmentation platform, a genetically engineered animal with an olfactory system 500 times more sensitive than a standard military working dog, cross-trained in tracking, attack, and signals intelligence, capable of identifying specific electronic emissions. Together, they were not a handler and a dog. They were a unified tracking system, a weapon that could see in the dark, smell through walls, and hunt in a hurricane. And Lieutenant Marcus Cutter, the self-proclaimed apex predator, had just shoved a living legend and called her sweetheart. The dramatic irony was a crushing weight, and it settled heavily in the dust-choked air of the cantina. He had not just made a mistake, he had committed a sacrilege. The storm raged for another hour, a biblical fury that scoured the world down to its bones. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it passed. The wind died down to a whisper, and a bruised purple twilight descended over the base. The world was remade, coated in a fresh layer of ochre dust, the air sharp and clean. Men emerged from their shelters, blinking in the strange new light. Out of the eerie calm, 2 figures walked toward the lights of the command post. It was Thorne and Ares. Thorne moved with the same unhurried, deliberate pace as before. She was covered head to toe in a fine layer of dust, a walking statue of sand. The dog trotted calmly at her side, his work done. Behind them, stumbling and bound at the wrists, was Tariq, Viper al-Jamil. He was also covered in sand, but his face was a mask of disbelief and terror. He had been hunted and caught by a ghost in a world where he thought he was king. Thorne walked him directly to the waiting arms of Master Chief Vance, who met her just outside the TOC. She handed him the prisoner's tether without a word. Vance looked at the HVT, then back at Thorne. He didn't offer congratulations or thanks. He simply nodded once, a gesture of profound, shared understanding between 2 masters of their craft. Then, his eyes hardened as he looked over her shoulder toward the cantina, from which Cutter and his men were now emerging, their faces pale with dawning comprehension. Vance's voice was quiet, but it carried across the open ground. "Attention on deck!" It was a command reserved for the arrival of a commissioned officer of high rank. Every soldier and operator within earshot, including Colonel Hayes, snapped to rigid attention. Cutter and his men, caught in the open, froze and then awkwardly followed suit. They stood like statues, their eyes locked forward, all except Cutter, whose gaze was fixed in horror upon the small, unassuming woman who was now the center of this universe of respect. Thorne paid them no mind. She was already tending to her partner, checking his paws for cuts and giving him water from her own canteen. The ceremony meant nothing to her. The mission was over. That was all that mattered. Later, in the sterile debriefing room, the reckoning came. Cutter stood before Colonel Hayes and Master Chief Vance, his arrogance stripped away, leaving behind a raw, hollowed-out shame. He offered no excuses. He simply stated the facts of his behavior, his voice a dull monotone. His fate is not mine to decide, Vance said, turning his gaze to Thorne, who sat at the far end of the table cleaning a piece of her equipment. Chief Warrant Officer Thorne, Lieutenant Cutter is one of my men. His conduct was unacceptable. I will begin Article 15 proceedings immediately. Thorne finished her task and looked up. She studied Cutter for a long moment, her gray eyes analytical, as if she were diagnosing a faulty piece of machinery. That won't be necessary, Master Chief, she said calmly. A formal punishment would be inefficient. It would teach him about consequences, but it wouldn't teach him the lesson. She turned her gaze to Cutter. Your failure, Lieutenant, was not one of character. It was tactical. You allowed your ego to obscure your threat assessment. You saw a woman, not an asset. You saw a dog, not a sensory platform. Your prejudice made you blind, deaf, and stupid. In a different situation, it would have gotten your men killed. Her words were not angry. They were sharp, precise, and utterly devastating because they were true. She was deconstructing his failure with the detached air of an instructor. You don't need punishment, Lieutenant, she continued. You need education. Master Chief, with your permission, I'm requisitioning the lieutenant for a temporary duty assignment. Vance raised an eyebrow. To where? To my unit, Thorne said. He will be my new kennel technician. His duties will include preparation of Ares's nutritional supplements, maintenance of the sensory augmentation harness, and sanitation of the mobile kennel. He will learn the value of a support asset by becoming one. He will learn to see beyond the uniform by wearing the one with the most dirt on it. He will remain in this assignment for 6 months, or until he can properly identify 17 different types of terrain contamination by scent particle alone, whichever comes last. The room fell silent. Colonel Hayes stared at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. Master Chief Vance looked at Cutter, whose face had gone white. The humiliation was absolute, a punishment so perfectly tailored, so exquisitely complete, that a court-martial would have been a kindness. He would not be a warrior. He would be scooping poop for the woman he had humiliated, under the watchful eye of the dog he had insulted. He would be forced, every single day, to confront the monument to his own arrogance. Cutter could only manage one word. Aye, ma'am. And so, the legend was born. The story of the Sandstorm ghost and Cutter's kenneling passed into the lore of the teams. It became a fable told at BUD/S, a cautionary tale for young, arrogant operators who thought their seal trident made them gods. It was a reminder that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one you notice least, that true strength is not loud, it is not boastful, and it does not need validation. True strength is quiet, disciplined, and devastatingly competent. Years passed. Lieutenant Cutter, as he was then, endured his re-education. He learned humility in the most profound way possible. He learned to see the intricate details he had once overlooked. He learned that the chain of command is only as strong as its quietest, most specialized link. He learned from Thorne not through lectures, but through observation. He watched her work, saw the monk-like dedication she brought to every task, from calibrating a sensor to brushing her dog. He saw a professional whose ego had been burned away, leaving only the pure, clean lines of her skill. He returned to the teams a different man. The booming arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, watchful confidence. He became one of the most respected platoon commanders in the community, known for his meticulous planning and his deference to the specialists under his command. He never again judged a book by its cover. And many years after that, Captain Marcus Cutter, an instructor at the Naval Special Warfare Center, would stand before a class of fresh-faced, eager young candidates. He would look out at their proud, invincible faces, and he would tell them a story. "There will come a day," he would say, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that now carried the weight of wisdom, not ego, "when you will think you are the baddest man in the valley. You will think your training, your weapon, and the trident on your chest make you invincible. And on that day, you will encounter someone who doesn't look like you, who doesn't talk like you, who doesn't fit your image of a warrior. They might be a quiet intel analyst, or a soft-spoken logistician, or maybe, just maybe, a plain-faced K9 handler in a dusty corner of the world." He would pause, letting the weight of his words settle on the young men. "And I want you to remember this," he would conclude, his eyes distant, seeing a ghost in a sandstorm. "That person, the one you are about to dismiss, might just be the one person on this earth who can walk through hell to save your soul. Your job is not to be the strongest. It's to be smart enough to recognize strength when you see it, no matter what uniform it's wearing. Let your actions, not your words, be your argument, and never, ever underestimate the quiet professional." The ultimate lesson of FOB Erebus was not about the capture of a single terrorist. It was a timeless moral, etched into the institutional memory by the scouring winds of a Kandahar sandstorm. It was a testament to the fact that substance will always, eventually, triumph over style. That competence is a currency that spends the same in any environment, and that the most profound authority is the one that is never claimed but simply demonstrated, leaving all witnesses in a state of silent, humbled awe.